This was a few months ago, but even now when I think about it, my skin crawls and my stomach feels heavy, like something rotten is sitting in there that won't go away, because what happened didn't feel like some weird prank or misunderstanding. It felt like staring into the eyes of someone who had crossed over into something dark and irreversible, and knowing you were standing just close enough to be dragged with them. I grew up in a forgotten little farming town called Mill Creek, where the houses sit far apart and the air always smells faintly of hay and diesel from the old tractors. And our high school was the kind of place that had trophies from the 1970s still proudly displayed in glass cases by the front office, because nothing much had changed since then. My graduating class was maybe 150 kids at most, so small that you could name nearly every face and probably tell what their dad did for a living. And like every tiny school, we had our cliques and our rumors, but not much in the way of real drama, except for one kid, who for the sake of this story I'll call Aaron. And he wasn't like the stereotypical quiet, creepy kid you see in movies. He wasn't pale or wearing trench coats or muttering to himself, but he had this stillness about him. Like when he walked down the hall, he barely existed, and people mostly left him alone, not out of kindness, but out of a weird instinct that told you not to poke whatever was coiled up inside him. We all sat in mixed grade electives because there weren't enough kids to fill single grade ones. And I happened to be in the same technology class as Aaron, a dusty old room in the back wing of the school filled with outdated computers and the faint smell of burnt dust from the radiators. The rows of desks were so tightly packed that you could feel someone shift behind you, but Aaron always chose the seat farthest from the door, right up against the window that looked out over the empty football field, like he wanted the escape route more than he wanted to be near people. And I'd occasionally catch him staring out there during lessons with this glassy, unreadable expression. At first, nobody really bothered him. But small towns breed boredom, and boredom breeds cruelty. And it started with whispers, then little jokes about how he never talked. And then some of the seniors started making a sport out of it, dropping pencils by his feet so he'd have to pick them up, tossing paper wads at him when the teacher's back was turned, calling him static because he never made a sound. Our teacher wasn't much help either, a middle-aged guy who looked perpetually tired and had this habit of pretending not to see anything so long as it kept the lesson moving. I'd feel a twist of guilt in my stomach watching Aaron flinch, but I didn't speak up. I told myself it wasn't my business, and like most people, I just kept my head down, which I regret more now than I can ever explain. One afternoon, after school, I found him sitting alone on the curb near the parking lot, his knees drawn up, staring at the cracked pavement like it might offer him some kind of answer, and something made me stop. Maybe guilt, maybe curiosity, and I asked him if he needed a ride, since I had my license and he obviously didn't. His eyes flickered up at me with this strange mix of surprise and relief, and he said yes softly. And during that short 10-minute drive, I learned more about him than I had known in 2 years. He spoke in a low, even voice about how he hated the noise of the cafeteria, how he hated the smell of the hallways, how he hated being a target. And he said it not like a kid venting, but like someone reading a list of things they'd already decided to erase from their life. I told him to ignore the jerks, that they'd be gone in a year anyway. But he just looked out the window and muttered something about how people always think it'll get better, but it doesn't. And that sentence stuck with me for days afterwards. After that, we'd nod at each other in the halls, small gestures that probably meant more to him than they did to me. And I thought maybe I'd done my good deed and that was the end of it, until the day that everything went wrong. It was a gray Thursday, the kind of day where the sky sits low and colorless over the fields. And halfway through our history class, the intercom crackled and our principal's voice came on tight and clipped, saying, "Lockdown, this is not a drill." And instantly, every sound in the room vanished like someone had hit mute. Our teacher went pale and scrambled to lock the door and turn off the lights, hissing for us to get down against the wall, and the way her hand shook made my heart lurch because if she was scared, then something was really happening. We crouched there in the dark, listening to the hum of the fluorescent lights and the faint echo of doors slamming somewhere down the hall, and every creak of the old building sounded like footsteps coming closer. Time stretched in that way it does when you're terrified. Minutes like hours, until a muffled announcement came on again, this time a man's voice, saying that there was an unknown individual on campus carrying a large black case, possibly armed, and to remain silent. Some of the kids around me were crying softly, and I remember thinking of my mom, of how she'd be at work at the diner right now, completely unaware that her kid was huddled in a dark classroom, maybe about to die. Eventually, we heard sirens outside, then nothing, then the all clear, but it wasn't over for me, not by a long shot. That night, after I'd been dropped at home by a friend because buses were canceled, I lay awake replaying everything. The lockdown, the look on Aaron's face when I last saw him a week before, and I couldn't shake a crawling suspicion that wouldn't name itself out loud. Sometime after midnight, I heard a faint knock at my window. So soft at first, I thought it was just a tree branch. But then it came again, deliberate, and I froze. The curtains were drawn, but I could see a shadow moving just beyond them, and every horror movie I ever saw flashed through my head as I whispered, "Who's there?" And a voice I recognized answered, Aaron's, saying my name like it was both a plea and a warning. My whole body went cold because part of me already knew what he was going to say, and when I cracked the window just enough to speak, he looked up at me with eyes that didn't seem to belong to the same boy I had driven home weeks ago and said I couldn't do it. I asked, heart pounding, "Do what?" Even though I already knew, and he said he had been the one with the case. He had come to school with something inside it that nobody should ever bring, but he had lost his nerve at the last second and left before the police got there. He told me he'd come to me because he was the only one who had ever been kind, and he needed someone to listen to him explain why he had planned something so terrible. I wanted to slam the window shut, but I couldn't move, caught between fear and pity because even though he was confessing to something monstrous, his voice trembled like a kid about to be punished. And for a second, I almost opened the window to let him in. Then I remembered the case, the lockdown, the screaming in my head, and I said, "You need to go to the police right now." But he just stared at me, his lips trembling, and whispered, "I don't think they'll help me," and started crying quietly right there under my window. Something in me snapped, and I yelled for my dad, loud enough for Aaron to flinch back into the darkness, and then he was gone. Just like that, running across the field behind our house like a shadow being swallowed up. I stumbled into my parents' room and tried to explain through shaking hands what had just happened, and my mom went white and called the sheriff while my dad grabbed his gun and stood by the front door like we were under siege. The police came within 20 minutes, their lights flashing against the walls like some twisted party. And I had to tell them everything. His name, what he'd said, what he'd done, and they nodded grimly like they'd already guessed, but needed confirmation. They went to his house, but he wasn't there, and for 2 days, nobody knew where he'd gone. The rumors at school were like wildfire, everyone speculating, some kids joking about it to cover their fear, but all I could think about was his face at my window, the way he said, I couldn't do it, like he wanted me to forgive him for almost turning us into a headline. Eventually, they found him holed up in an abandoned barn on his uncle's property with the case still beside him, and the news said he was charged with making a terroristic threat, but I know it was more than that. He had a plan, a terrible one, and only at the last second had something cracked enough in him to stop. Sometimes late at night, I think about how easily it could have gone the other way. How if he hadn't lost his nerve, my name would be carved in a memorial somewhere instead of telling you this story. And what haunts me most isn't the fear, but the memory of that 10-minute car ride where I had a chance to do more, to say something that might have steered him off that path completely, and how he came back to me at the end, not as a killer, but as a boy clutching the edge of a cliff, hoping someone would pull him back. I don't know where he is now, if he got help or if he's sitting somewhere planning again, but every time I hear a knock at my window after dark, my heart still leaps into my throat, expecting to see his face staring back at me, asking for something I'm not sure anyone can give.